Is anything original? Is everything derivative? And is fanfiction ethical? If you're chronically online like me, then you've probably seen a bunch of people on TikTok, book talk, crying over a 1,000-page book called Alchemized by JEN-nuh-nee. Now, people crying on book talk is nothing new, but Alchemized happens to be the traditionally published version of what was originally a Harry Potter fanfic, specifically for the ship Dramione. The fic was called Manacled, and it was published by JEN-nuh-nee over the course of a few years from 2018, as they wrote the fic on the notes app of their phone as they took care of their child. Manacled went on to be published in 19 different languages and became one of the most popular fanfictions on AO3, or Archive of Our Own, which is one of the biggest fanfiction platforms. Now, the concept of fanfiction getting traditionally published by a Big Five publisher is nothing new. We've seen it happen multiple times before. You've seen it with 50 Shades of Grey, and we've also seen it recently with a few other Dramione fanfics that were published as traditionally published books. One was Rose in Chains by Julie Soto, and the other was The Irresistible Urge to Fall for Your Enemy by Bridget Knightley. Now, what's been curious about this whole situation is the public response to Alchemized versus all of these other fanfictions, especially the last two that came out. There was a lot of public outrage over the fact that these fanfictions were based off of a very problematic source work, Harry Potter, which is by a very problematic author, J.K. Rowling, actually a awful human being in general, to the point where Julie Soto had to remove herself from a convention because of all of the backlash. And in the midst of this, I've been trying to figure out what the difference is between Alchemized and these other fanfics that everyone has been up in arms about. But with that question, we also get the idea of, is fanfiction in general, a good thing? Is it ethical? What makes it different from something like a retelling? Something that's also a derivative work, but that is seemingly accepted in social culture, even to the point where books like James by Percival Everett is getting a Pulitzer Prize, but everyone is frowning upon fanfiction. Well, that's what I'm going to explain today, and also just give you my general thoughts and discussion on this topic, on fanfiction, if anything is original, is publishing a Harry Potter fanfic supporting J.K. Rowling. But I think we need to start at the beginning by defining some of these terms and understanding some legal terms that really are the difference between fanfiction and something that's simply a retelling. If you're new here, hi, I'm JEN-nuh-nee, and this is my channel, This Story Ain't Over, where I try to give you as many diverse book recommendations as I can that are by BIPOC and marginalized authors. And every now and then I do some discussion-y videos like this one, where I give you all of my unfiltered, honest opinions. So with that said, go hit that like button and subscribe, and let's get into the video. Okay, we're going to start by defining some legal terms. So the first one that we need to know is intellectual property. Intellectual property is a category of property that includes intangible creations of the human intellect. There are many types of intellectual property, and some countries recognize more than others. The best known types are patents, copyrights, trademarks, and trade secrets. So what does this mean? Essentially, intellectual property means that you are able to claim something that you have created from your mind, from your intellect, as something that you own. And therefore, someone would have to obtain legal permission to use, quote, or reference those works. Very often you copyright something so that no one else can make money off of it. Now, we also have a legal category called public domain. Public domain consists of all the creative work to which no exclusive intellectual property rights apply. Those rights may have expired, been forfeited, expressly waived, or may be inapplicable. Because no one holds the exclusive rights, anyone can legally use or reference those works without permission. All of us are pretty familiar with public domain works. They're usually works that are very old because they existed before copyright existed, but there are some that are a little bit more recent that have only lapsed into public domain recently. One really good example of that is The Great Gatsby. The Great Gatsby was published in 1925, and the author died in 1940. Now, why is The Great Gatsby special? Well, because it's one of those works that's very popular, has been taught in schools, and that, off the top of your mind, you might think is public domain or has always been in public domain, but actually it wasn't. The Great Gatsby was affected by something called the CTEA, which is the Copyright Term Extension Act that was passed in 1998. Essentially, the US Congress, this is the US, and copyright laws are different across different countries, but the US Congress passed this act to extend the term of protection for many copyrighted works. So for many years, there were a lot of works that would have lapsed into public domain, but because of the Extension Act, they were kind of like put on hold. They had an extension, and so they only recently became public domain. And The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald was one of these works. And so because of this situation, The Great Gatsby only lapsed into public domain on January 1st of 2021, which is only 4 years ago. Now, the reason I mentioned The Great Gatsby is because it's a perfect example example of the gray area of copyright laws and of our social expectations when it comes to what makes something a fan fiction, something that you cannot monetize in its current original form, and something like a retelling, like the books James by Percival Everett, which is essentially a retelling of the adventures of Huckleberry Finn, but from the perspective of the slave Jim or James. James won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction, and it's heralded as this reclamation of this classic and giving a voice to the voiceless. There are also some very popular mythology retellings like Circe or the Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. The Song of Achilles takes the Iliad by Homer and retells that from the perspective of Patroclus and has a more defined queer element to it. Now, both of these works are very much essentially retellings, and they're absolutely intertwined with works that exist in the public domain. Now, when we get to The Great Gatsby, in recent years, you've probably noticed a lot of retellings coming out. One that I read recently and absolutely adored was Local Heavens by K.M. Fajardo. This is a cyberpunk 2075 retelling of The Great Gatsby with more queer elements to it, and it was absolutely fabulous. But the thing about Local Heavens that's really interesting is that had the author tried to get it published before 2021, they would not have been able to, simply because The Great Gatsby was still copyrighted. It was still protected under the term of protection from its original copyright. And so therefore you could not traditionally publish or monetize a story that referenced or took parts from the original text. And had that story existed prior to 2021, then, maybe the author might have posted it on fanfiction.net or on AO3 as a fan fiction, because at that point, that's the only place it could exist, because fanfiction is this beautiful little space that is not monetized. It is a space where writers can play with a story that is copyrighted and exercise their writing muscles and build an audience, but the limitation of fanfiction is that it is this vulnerable space that exists between copyright laws. Now, because it's past 2021, The Great Gatsby has lapsed into public domain, and so any retelling or work that references it or is inspired by it heavily, uses the character names and that kind of thing, all of those works are allowed to exist legally and can be monetized, and the authors can make money off of it, and it is somehow socially accepted. Now, you could argue that the whole social acceptability of retellings versus fan fiction is also related to the public consciousness and the idea that a lot of public domain works, the reason that they have lapsed into public domain is because a lot of time has passed. Decades have passed. A whole lifetime, in theory, has passed since these books were released or since the author died. And so in some ways, although The Great Gatsby is this great classic, there isn't the same emotional investment to the work, and a lot of the people that were around when it was first published are simply gone now. So now we know what intellectual property is, what public domain is, and what's covered under copyright. Now let's talk about Harry Potter, which is the basis and the fandom that these fan fictions have been written about and inspired by. Harry Potter was written by J.K. Rowling, and she is still alive, and the books were released in the 90s and then into the 2000s, and they still are covered under copyright laws, and J.K. Rowling owns those rights. Now, she owns those rights, but she's also sold her film rights to Warner Brothers, who has made many, many, many movies, and has also done a lot of licensing and other stuff with those rights, including amusement parks, action figures, video games, and all of these things make money off of this intellectual property. The idea of Harry Potter and Hogwarts, the world, the characters, the likeness of these characters is all copyrighted by Warner Brothers and then also J.K. Rowling. So any work that exists that uses Harry Potter and any of these elements of the IP is technically not allowed to be legally monetized because it uses this IP. Now let's get into fanfiction. What is it if you're not familiar with it? I am actually a longtime fanfiction reader. I used to write fanfiction back in high school, and I used to write fanfiction and post it on fanfiction.net way back in the day before AO3. So that just shows how old I am. Thank you very much. Fanfiction is essentially stories, novels, short stories, flash fiction, sometimes it's poetry even, that is based off of a certain fandom or a copyrighted IP. Sometimes it can be a non-copyrighted IP, and they still post it on an online fanfiction, place because they're not interested in getting published, but they just want to share their stories. Now, traditionally, fanfiction, I think, started on fanfiction.net. I might be wrong, but I do remember that fanfiction.net did go through and basically sanitize their library and archive of stuff of a lot of mature content. And that was the major reason for why a lot of people left fanfiction.net. And then AO3, or Archive of Our Own, was started. There are also fanfictions that were posted on Wattpad. People used to post them on their blogs. Some people posted on Tumblr. Like, fanfiction existed in many different forms on many different platforms. But the important point is that all these platforms were online, they were not monetized, and it was clearly stated what fandom these fics were about. Now, this is the key thing that allows fanfiction to exist as it does today, because the second it's printed and produced for other people to use or buy, or the second that it is monetized on one of these platforms, like someone collects a subscription for you to read their fanfiction, the second that happens, they're violating the law. But the general consensus in the industry is that authors, copyright holders, just allow these fanfiction writers to write what they want and write this fanfiction and sort of exist in the world and with the characters of this story, this original work, and, extrapolate from there or interpolate from there. It's a really beautiful place for people to extend their love of this work, and also for writers who are maybe starting out or just trying to get some practice in to work within the confines of this already existing work, whether that's using the world of that work or using the characters or a specific ship. A ship means, who you ship with each other, like a relationship. And it allows these writers to simply practice the craft of writing with these elements that they are borrowing. Now, one thing about fanfiction is that a lot of people just think that it's like smut, or that it's only fics that are very, very heavily set in the world of the original work and then make slight differences or just have the characters have sex. That is not the case. I mean, there are some that do that. Most of the time, and a lot of fics actually take a lot of liberties to the original work, to the point where you might not even recognize it as the same, fandom if you weren't squinting pretty hard. And so in some ways, there are some fanfictions that are online that are very much the heart and soul of that writer's intellect and mind. We start to get into this gray area of, well, how much of this is the fanfic writer's own imagination and property because they've written all these words, they've put it onto the page together and made you feel these things, and how much of that is the original copyright owner's stuff. And this is where we get some contention between which traditionally published fanfics are socially acceptable. The concept of fanfiction being published traditionally is not something new. Essentially, for any fanfic to be traditionally published or monetized in any way, it needs to be sanitized of the original IP, meaning any proper names, any significant settings, places, things that exist in the copyrighted work in a tangible way, those need to be removed or changed in some way in order for the work to be monetized. But this in and of itself is a very, very, very gray area. And I'm sure at some point, J.K. Rowling's gonna come swinging out of nowhere on her, turf train to sue someone, and most likely Senlin Yu, and I feel it coming, guys. Although you can remove the parts of the original copyrighted work, there's an element that a lot of these newer works that are coming out are getting marketed as Dramione fanfics or Harry Potter fanfics that have been turned into a new story. And I think it's the element of using the copyrighted IP as part of your marketing, which then reveals also that the work was originally a fanfic, that gets you into this weird gray category of, well, potentially J.K. Rowling could just come out of nowhere and, sue you for publishing this and monetizing this work. And I'm sure she hasn't done it up to this point because, it's not worth it for every small fry. And I'm sure it would require a whole legal battle of comparing, the copyrighted work to the fanfic, in detail to see if it was changed enough. But I also think this whole marketing these fics as Harry Potter fanfics gets us into this really gray area. And I think that's one of the things that's been sort of icky to a lot of people recently, where publishers are promoting these new books and marketing them with the sales hook of them being previously Dramione fanfics or Harry Potter fanfics, a way to experience that world through this new work. And some may argue that, this is the authors and these writers reclaiming this work that they loved that later was ruined by all of J.K. Rowling's awfulness. But it also raises the question, well, if you're using that original copyrighted work and, this awful woman's work to promote your work, then are you not indirectly promoting J.K. Rowling's work? This is what a lot of trans activists have been saying, and many people have been saying. Does it not feel icky to be using this as a selling point when we know the harm that J.K. Rowling has done? And this also ties into sort of this idea that, a lot of us have been contending with. Media and books is so intent on doing new adaptations of the same old stories or giving us unnecessary sequels to stories that should have ended years ago. And within that, it's the idea of we're constantly trying to keep this one IP alive and make as much money off of it for as long as we can. And in part, I think it ties into, the millennial nostalgia factor of just wanting to go back to the thing that you loved as a child and make your child experience it and love it the same way that you did, which is its own, problem. But for me, what is interesting is that we are all falling for the trap that publishing is setting for us, which is essentially to capitalize on our nostalgia, on what we loved, and get us to continuously buy these things that are based off of these problematic legacies, simply by spinning it in this new way. Now, of course, we can argue the whole idea of reclamation of a work, and you could also argue that in the sense of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, where Percival Everett wrote this new novel, James, and it wins a Pulitzer because it is taking a originally racist work and putting it in a new light. There are people who will argue that J.K. Rowling is an awful trans-hating person, and by writing this new retelling or fanfic of her work, the author is reclaiming that story and allowing for a new thing to be told. And I think this is one of the reasons why Alchemized is viewed so differently from Rose in Chains, The Irresistible Urge to Fall for Your Enemy, which both I've heard are not so different from the original fanfics that they were based off of. I don't know for sure. I've never read them or the original fanfics. But what I keep hearing about Alchemized is that one, it was, changed and edited so heavily to be its own thing. And two, that the author, Sen-Lin Yu, is non-binary. And so I've been hearing the arguments that because Sen-Lin Yu is non-binary, this is a reclamation of the original work from someone who is, trans and non-binary hating. But we still haven't traversed past the legal element involved here, which is that Harry Potter is still under copyright. And by allowing these fanfics that have been sanitized of the original IP to be published, publishers are walking a very, very thin line of what is legally acceptable. And again, I feel like something is coming because Alchemized is a unique situation compared to some of these other fanfics that have been published in that it was a fanfic, Manacled, that was so popular on the platform. So many Harry Potter fans loved it. A lot of people are picking up Alchemized because they loved Manacled. And a lot of its plot points, regardless of the fact that Sen-Lin Yu has edited and adapted them, originated with the original world of Harry Potter. And also Alchemized, compared to some of the other fanfics, has made a ton of money already. The book originally sold to the publisher for hundreds of thousands of dollars, I think over $600K. And recently the film rights also sold at auction for over $3 million. That is a lot of money, not to J.K. Rowling, but it is a lot of money. And that is a lot of money that she's thinking, maybe it should have been mine. And maybe I shouldn't let this happen. Now, regardless of that, let's talk a little bit about how Alchemized came to be and what I think is a little bit shady about this situation. I did some research on Sen-Lin Yu and also this whole idea of them getting published and sort of revising Manacled. And I think what it all comes down to at the end of things is money and making money off of a work that you created in part. Like I said before, fanfiction exists in this gray area. Fanfic writers are allowed to use this space, use these copyrighted works in a non-monetized way. But there is this element of fanfic authors being very vulnerable in the sense that they can't make money off these works, and their works are posted on these online platforms that aren't completely safe from people ripping off their stories or, copying them or putting them somewhere else. And they're also not safe from people downloading the stories and doing something with that. And this is something that Sen-Lin Yu talks about in their Substack. As most of you know, I've been a reader in fandom long before I ever began to write. Fanfiction is incredibly special to me, and I have tried to do my best not to undermine its legal protection or allow my works to do so either. During the last several years, there has been a growing issue with illegal sales of Manacled, putting both me and the incredible community that shares fanfiction freely in legal jeopardy. After consulting with the OTW as well as other lawyers, it has grown clear that as a transformative writer, I have limited options in protecting my stories from this kind of exploitation, but I wasn't sure what to do. I didn't want to just take the story down, in part because I was worried that might only exacerbate the issue, but I didn't know what other options I had. Then I suddenly had this idea of alchemy, which was peculiarly appropriate, I can't say that word, an academic world filled with unique transmutation abilities and a necromantic war against people who had discovered the secrets of immortality. And I could see a path to reimagining the story while still holding on to as much of the original spirit of Manacled as possible. This has happened with fanfiction for a long time. A lot of people who read fanfic and they really love a story, sometimes they want to have a physical copy of that fic that they loved and not just have it in a digital format. And so what people will do is download the stories and then print them out and bind them into beautiful books and and post about it on social media, which is all fine and dandy if they only do it for themselves. But the second that someone starts printing and distributing and selling those copies, whether it's online or, physical copies, then we come up against the legal protection that fanfiction has because it's not monetized. And also, as Sen-Lin Yu is saying, they felt exploited by this situation, but they didn't want to take down the fic and encourage that behavior. But also, they were not earning money from these copies that were being sold. And I think this is where the gray area again comes back. And this is where I can't really decide what I feel about this, because yes, on the one hand, they have written this fiction, but on the other hand, they have based it off of someone else's copyrighted work. And if they want to monetize it, that's not really legal nor a good thing. Like, they're still using someone else's work. And it seems to me while reading the Substack that the main driving force behind getting Manacled published as a traditionally published work was to monetize it. And while you may say like, well, yeah, of course they should get paid for the writing that they do, but I think not for the writing that they've done based off of someone else's work. No one has a problem if this author goes on to write their own original novel and get that published. I think even if they had used their pen name for that work, that might have been okay, because they would have been capitalizing on the popularity that they got on the platform as a writer and would have used that towards the new work that they're doing. But it's interesting to me that they specifically wanted to make money off of this work, off of Manacled, and prevent anyone else from making money off of it. Now, I just want to say here that I don't have like a vendetta against Sen-Lin Yu, like they can do whatever they want, but I do think there's something suspect about trying to make money off of someone else's work that you have created a derivative work of. Now, you may come to me and be like, well, all these other authors did it for these works that are in public domain. And yes, I agree, but I do think that there is a level of commentary and broader social implications of doing a retelling of a very old work that comes from a time from very different circumstances or public opinion or just generally like bigotry, that these retellings have something very new to say by doing a retelling of this old work. Whereas doing a retelling of a work that recently existed doesn't have the same level of removal that allows you to make any sort of meaningful commentary. Now, you could argue, well, do books have to have meaningful commentary? Do they have to mean something? Can't they just be for entertainment? And yes, they can. I think that's fine. And there are plenty of, retellings that are romances, not that romances can't be intellectual, but like they're mainly for fun, which I think is fine. But yeah, I think it's this gray area, and this is where I think a lot of the opinions kind of get subjective. But the one thing that is not subjective is the legality of it. And until Harry Potter lapses into public domain, all of these fanfics that are getting published are still going to exist in this gray area. Now, back to the, journey that took Alchemized to get published, I think one of the things that's also very interesting is that, I don't think this is all Sen-Lin Yu trying to make money. I think it's very much the publisher or a publisher trying to make money. And what I find interesting about their story is, as they say in their Substack, I began redrafting the concept privately around Christmas 2022. And then, as if the universe had aligned, just as I was finishing, Caitlin Mahoney and Rivka Bergman of WME reached out to me and were delightfully enthusiastic about concepts and ideas for my new alchemical world and the ways I have reimagined the story. They then go on to say that they sold the book to Del Rey, which is the traditional publisher. But what I think is interesting here is that Sen-Lin Yu did not go out and find an agent after they had finished this rewrite and get one based off the merit of that book. In theory. What did happen, though, was that these two agents saw the opportunity of this fanfic author with a huge audience, with a huge following, intends to rework her big fandom work, and that could make a lot of money. And I think this is where, for me, at the end of the day, publishing is always a problem, and you will learn if you watch my videos, I am publishing's biggest lover, but also biggest freaking hater, because publishing is ultimately a business, and it's always about making money, and they're always trying to capitalize on the stories that they think will sell, as opposed to any sort of idea of merit. And so I think what makes, Alchemized and all these other fanfics the same in a sense is that publishers are allowing them to happen, to be published, because they know that they can just simply make money off of them. Whether that's by marketing them to people who previously loved Harry Potter, or just using that as a hook point for people who are just vaguely interested in creating some controversy and conversation, or simply by monetizing that existing audience that the author had. Sen-Lin Yu does go through how they changed the story a lot. And you could argue that all the parts that were inspired by Harry Potter have been significantly changed, and they've added their own new ideas, and so doesn't that make it a new thing? And a lot of people have argued, if they didn't know about this whole Dramione Harry Potter thing, saying they would have picked up the book and completely not known that it was inspired by Harry Potter. And I think that's a fair argument. I think there's an element of, had they, written a Harry Potter fanfic on their own and then realized, oh no, the story could be really good if I changed these elements and made it my own, and then went to get it published, but no one had seen it on fanfic and hadn't read it, and it didn't have this huge popularity, I think we wouldn't really care. There is an element of writers sort of working off of ideas that they know and love. One thing I should mention is that Alchemized, and therefore Manacled, was originally inspired also by The Handmaid's Tale, and this idea of these women, these handmaids, sort of in this rapey slave situation. There's plenty of people who love the concept of like two different stories and then kind of mash them together and then make their own story out of that. So again, like all of this just kind of gets into a gray area of what is original, what is not. And is it only the legality of it that makes it socially acceptable? Or is it the idea of it being built on a work that is not problematic? But then what about works like James that is also inspired by something problematic? And so really I have no answers there, but I would love to talk a little bit about this whole idea of dramione fanfics in specific being popular, being published by traditional publishers, and how Alchemized in specific is interesting because it is essentially a story. And if anyone tries to tell you otherwise, like, they're just lying to themselves, because it essentially boils down to Harry loses the war against Voldemort, Hermione gets sold into slavery, Draco buys her, and then they both fall in love. And that is the basic plot line of Manacled and therefore Alchemized. And even though Alchemized has new characters with new names and, it's been sanitized of this whole Harry Potter situation, the fact remains that the storyline itself is quite interesting in that it sort of romanticizes this situation. Now, I haven't read Alchemized, so I can't say, and I don't want to get into the territory of trying to judge its quality or merit in any way. However, I do think this leads us into a very strange thing that is happening in romantasy and dark romance and all these popular romances that are towing this line between what is like consensual and what is not. And also this weird racial play that comes into things. There's been a lot of talk of a lot of romantasies having a vaguely brown male love interest and a white female main character, and her sort of taming him in some way and the racial implications of that. And when we get to Manacled, Hermione is a character who is traditionally racially ambiguous. And as we know from the casting of the play, The Cursed Child, there was a lot of backlash about Hermione potentially being black, even though her big hair, her curly hair is mentioned at many points, and her skin color is never actually confirmed in the Harry Potter series. And so you could argue that she was meant to be a woman of color, specifically a black woman. And so it's interesting to me, and this is something that someone brought up in my Instagram DMs when I asked for, thoughts on this whole situation, this idea of this pseudo-slavery romance that also involves a character who was based off of a original character who was potentially black, and that Yu is not black. And does the fact that they are non-binary, erase all of the problematicness of the work and of, the original work that it was based off of? So yeah, there's all of these different considerations to look at. And I think with this video, I'm not here to give you any answers or police what you read. Teletubbies on TikTok had a really great video about this, and so did Marina's. My name is Marina's. Teletubbies also mentioned something about the judgment paradox.
The question on everybody's lips is, does engaging with this work sort of reflect back on you as a person, right? Everybody needs everything that they read to be the most moral reflection of what they are and what they believe and if they're a good person. And it sounds like I'm being facetious, but I'm not, right? A lot of people who are engaging with this work are saying that it's actually radical and revolutionary, and they're doing it for all of the good reasons, which everyone who's not on their side is like, there's no real way that you can engage with this work in a radical revolutionary way, right? Like at the end of the day, people are still being led to J.K. Rowling's work. We thought that maybe they weren't going to, but they are. They're on TikTok saying, I can't wait to read Harry Potter now. Anyway, that was 3 minutes of backstory to say one thing that I wanted to say. You can do whatever you want. You can't prevent people from talking shit about you. I'm sorry. There seems to be this weird, I call it the judgment paradox. There seems to be this weird thing where people on the internet want to do whatever they want and also be exempt from criticism. That is just not how life works. I'm sorry.
I think no matter what you do, you cannot talk positively about a work that has its origins in a problematic person and author without sort of acknowledging that. And I think what makes Alchemized different from James by Percival Everett in a sense is that Alchemized is not doing anything against the original work. It is not reclaiming that story in an actual sense, in the actual narrative. We are saying this in a more conceptual sense of just Sen-Lin Yu writing the story and making money off of it. But James is a story that actually interrogates the idea of race within the adventures of Huckleberry Finn and gives a voice to Jim or James and makes us think of that work in a different way. And maybe that's what makes it more socially acceptable. And then, we get again into the conversation of, well, does everything need to mean something? And I think in this day and age where we can barely get people to care about a genocide, I think I would just love for people to care more about what all of these things do and affect, and how we don't have to beat down the same story and keep this legacy alive. I am truly waiting for the day that J.K. Rowling becomes absolutely obsolete and no one cares about her anymore. But I do suspect on some level, and some people have been saying, J.K. Rowling hasn't sued Sen-Lin Yu and she's probably getting some sort of financial kickback. That's why she hasn't done it. And I don't think so. I think that she is enraged by the situation, by Sen-Lin Yu themselves, by the money that they are making. And I think J.K. Rowling is going to slap back. But I worry at the PR and the attention that is going to get, because at the end of the day, it's still going to bring attention back to Harry Potter and to this general way that we have kept that work alive, when we could be expending that energy towards actually reading books by trans authors and uplifting trans voices and actually doing the work that goes into making sure that the harm that J.K. Rowling has done with her online presence, with her, celebrity, with her series is actually combated. So yes, thank you all so much for watching. Those were my honest opinions on Alchemized, on fanfiction, on whether things are original or not. And I feel like I asked a lot of questions and may not have given you all of the answers, but I think I'm okay with that, as long as you are thinking and considering and forming your own opinions as well. And if you like this video, then maybe stick around for some more like it and hit that like button and subscribe. Thank you so much to my Bindery members for supporting me and my channel. If you want to join my newsletter, you can go join it at the link down below, boundless.binderybooks.com, and you'll get behind the scenes exclusive content from me, and also a whole Discord where I come and chat with you and run reading sprints. I will see you all in my next video, and please remember that the story ain't over. Bye!